I'd like to start by talking about the Living Wage campaign. You're its founder.
Well, I was one of the founders, but actually a really kind of important premise has been that there's strength in numbers and that accomplishing things as an activist is all about being part of a movement, and so it's really about a collectivity and coalitions with different groups. So so I was one of a number of faculty members, but also undergraduates, graduate students, very initially small number of staff people who launched the Living Wage campaign back in 1998.
Great. Why did you want to start one, and what factors influenced you?
So, I've always been concerned with social justice issues, and this was a sort of obvious instance of inequity, right in UVA's backyard. Not backyard, actually, like at UVA. I mean, that's sort of one of the injustices that we want to correct, is this sense that when you talk about the university, you only talk about students and then maybe faculty and then maybe board of visitors, when in fact there are thousands and thousands of workers, staff people, who, without whom the university couldn't run. So we partly wanted to make those folks visible, give them a voice, improve their wages, improve their working conditions. So, as I say, it seemed like a pressing social justice issue, and one that really, part of my background is working on gender issues, and so it was clear that wage inequity affected women disproportionately, and also, as we know in Charlottesville, that class is really racialized, and so it really disproportionately, the low-wage workers at UVA are really disproportionately African American or non-white. There was a report done in 1996, actually by the university, called the Muddy Floor Report. So as opposed to the glass ceiling, it really showed that very, very few African Americans at the highest levels of administration or even faculty or even clerical workers, that they really were clustered at the bottom doing things like food service and custodial work. So it was very clear that living wage as an issue was also a race issue.
Right. And what changes have you noticed since the beginning of the movement and the campaign?
So that's kind of a huge question, because it's now been a couple decades. So I could talk for a while about that. So one thing is that when we started out, just in terms of numbers, the starting wage for low-wage staff was under $6.50. We started out demanding $8 as a living wage. The other thing is that the whole concept of a living wage was very new at that time. There were some cities, Baltimore, LA, there's some municipalities that had living wage ordinances. But in terms of universities, we were really the first to focus on university staff and demand a living wage for them. So, in 1998, the concept was different, whereas now you have a national fight for 15, you have presidential, nominees, demanding a living wage, and you have lots of other universities who have living wage policies, and Charlottesville itself is a living wage city, but that was not the case. That really came out of our campaign. So now in terms of numbers, there's been, the starting wage has crept up, and then recently took a leap with President Ryan's move to pay people $15 an hour. But I would still say that's actually not quite a living wage for Charlottesville, that I know the campaign is now asking for $16.84. So it's really important that the concept of a living wage means a wage that is indexed to the cost of living, so that it always covers just basic necessities, but at a rate that keeps pace with inflation. So as I say, just in terms of numbers, things have changed dramatically. There's now obviously a smaller gap between living wage and what people earn, but I worry that gap's going to increase unless we have an actual policy that says we're not going to stay at 15. It's going to keep increasing with the cost of living. But the personnel, the people have changed. There have been many phases. It really started out, it was really initiated by a colleague of mine in history, Nelson Lichtenstein, who's a labor historian. So he was the one who, it's actually not completely true. He brought the idea that people who were concerned about labor issues at universities and people concerned with labor issues outside of universities should come together and be part of a more robust labor movement. And so we had a teach-in with the labor movement, which was supposed to sort of begin to establish the basis for such a movement in 1997. And then it was after that that we realized that to try to, for example, organize workers into a union would be premature and difficult, and we're a right-to-work state, and that's a complicated concept, but we decided to start with the idea of a living wage. And that actually came from someone in the community who was tied to Virginia Organizing, Public Housing Association of Residents, who suggested that this would be a way to make a kind of ethically obvious case for better wages, and could demonstrate that when people get together they can make a difference. So that was really the origin of it. So faculty, as I say, took the lead at that moment, but then eventually there would be a staff union, and staff would really be in the forefront of advocating for wage issues, but also issues of the safety, working conditions at the hospital. And then also, obviously, students at different points have taken the lead. You mentioned the sit-in in 2006, and then there's also hunger strike in 2012. And in between, lots and lots of kinds of rallies and demonstrations and petitions, led often by students, but again, there was a faculty support group. So that coalition has been really important, involving staff and students and faculty, but who has been actually in the forefront. That's something that has changed since the beginning.
Okay, thank you. And Charlottesville, as a city, has had quite a few wage protests that we've looked at throughout our research. Mm-hmm. And why do you think that Charlottesville in particular has this kind of experience and different from other cities or different other college towns?
Well, I'm not sure it is so different. We happen to have about a 25% poverty rate. So given how very wealthy some sectors of the university are, or the community are, and the fact that it's a university town, that's perhaps surprising. But obviously, in New York City, Columbia is enormously wealthy, but they're, in a neighborhood where there's a great deal of poverty. So the sort of, town gown kind of, rift and sometimes conflict is, more typical than not of universities, and often, the university as an employer is not as exemplary as it should be. So here we are the largest area employer, and we have the ability to affect wages. We do affect the wage scale, and yet we've really paid inadequate wages. Mm-hmm. We've employed a lot of people and not paid them enough. So, as I say, it's not incredibly atypical, but it is really the case here that the community has provided workers, and yet we haven't given back as much to the community as we could.
How does not having a living wage affect the relationship between UVA and the community, and how do protests affect the relationship between UVA and the community, in your opinion?
So I think what I was just saying really speaks partly to this negative effect that the university can have on the community, and the potential it has to have a positive effect on the community. And I guess that Ryan's recent move really was in response to a survey that had to do with wanting to improve town-gown relationships. So obviously paying living wage is a really good way to do that. And so protests, as I say, the living wage protests have been, sometimes initiated by students and involving the campus, but the reason that Charlottesville, the city, became a living wage city is that the campaign went to the city council, and so a lot of the city councilors, Kristen Sagos, for example, or some of the local politicians, they've been involved with the campaign. I mentioned, Public Housing Association of Residents, Virginia Organizing. Those are grassroots organizing groups in town, and they've also been involved in campaigning with us. So protests actually are a way to create ties not only between faculty, students, staff, but also between people in the university and people outside the university. So the protests have been really good for those relationships. They've been, kind of site of solidarity.
How does having a wage rate below the living wage tie into UVA's history, Jeffersonian, sorry, how does having a wage rate below the living wage tie into UVA's history of Jeffersonian history?
Well, I've already spoken to that a little bit, that, as we know, Mr. Jefferson owned slaves, and the university was built by slaves, and to the extent that the poverty wages are really racialized, sort of an aspect of structural racism in our town, it is a legacy of this, era of slavery and of Jim Crow and of sort of longstanding racial inequity. So it's really intimately tied to that. I know that, one problem has been, and it speaks to the problem, that staff themselves, the most vulnerable staff members, are sometimes having to work 2 or 3 jobs to make ends meet, but also really fear retaliation. And so, as I say, there was a period where there was, 6 years a staff union, but often, it's been a really positive contribution on the part of students and faculty that they have spoken out in a, based on their somewhat less vulnerable position, in a way that staff have not always been able to speak for themselves. To the extent that they have spoken off the record, they will say this is a plantation, that the relations are still, white people at the top and that muddy floor at the bottom. And again, just recognizing the valuable work that employees do in terms of wages, but also just in terms of recognition and having a voice. And this does go to the fact that UVA, that the Virginia is a right-to-work state, which means that doesn't mean that you cannot form a union. And many people, but employees in particular, misunderstand that to mean, oh, we're not allowed to form a union. And they are. One thing that we found in our movement is that even staff who tried to be part of the living wage campaign often suffered from retaliation. And so no wonder they get this message that any kind of organizing or belonging to a union is prohibited. What it actually means is that you have the right to work whether or not you belong to a union. So you can't be required to belong to a union, you can't have what's known as a closed shop, but you can form a union. I've lost my point here, except that, I guess I was just saying that part of the goal is to have a voice. It's to have better wages, but it's also to be able to speak out without fear of retaliation.
Mm-hmm. So, Living Wage campaign was started in 1998. Why do you think it has taken until January 2020 for this change to happen at UVA due to Jim Ryan's recent changes? Do you believe this is a change or just part of the same pattern?
Well, in fact, there have been, the movement has had a huge effect. Mm-hmm. First of all, just sort of to put into circulation this concept of the living wage, I promised some show and tell.
Yes.
We started out really pointing out the sort of discrepancy in wages. Now this was, again, back in 1998, that the provost and vice president were earning $240,000, whereas housekeepers were starting at around $11,000. So that's where we began, by talking about those kinds of discrepancies. But 2 years later, by the year 2000, they had actually raised wages up over $8 an hour, and that was our we had buttons that said $8. That was our figure, and that's what was then a living wage in Charlottesville. Then really, with each sort of huge protest, especially protests that got a lot of coverage, even national media coverage, with the sit-in of 2006, what do you know, the following summer, wages bumped up significantly. And the same thing after the hunger strike, wages bumped up. So just the fact that there has been sort of self-consciousness around the issue and kind of constant pressure, and raising a public awareness about it, and then again, especially after these more dramatic acts of protest, there have been improvements. So, I think just the time was right. And as I mentioned, just in terms of the national climate, We know that nationally that economic disparity has really just increased dramatically. And so there is just a national outcry around this issue and awareness of this issue. I think that President Ryan is, first of all, he came from Harvard, and Harvard, not all by itself, but because there was a living wage movement there, did implement, they have a living wage, some kind of living wage policy. And I now think that their workers started up over $20 an hour. And I don't know how the cost of living in Boston compares to here, but so there was a really good model in terms of the place that he was coming from. He was previously a law professor here, and over the last 20 years, I have seen and partly been responsible for countless sort of petitions and things where we're getting people to endorse a living wage. Well, what do you know? He was someone who, during one of those periods, signed a petition endorsing a living wage. So, I think it's an issue that he genuinely cares about, and he's taken a leadership role in relation to it. But I would say that it is absolutely crucial, what I've mentioned before, that it be indexed to the cost of living. Otherwise, we fight this battle all over again. It's already obsolete. In a couple of years, it really will be inadequate. And so we don't want to sort of have to wait for an enlightened president and sort of the right moment for someone to bump up wages again. We need to have that built in. The other thing which is not done, which is really, really, really important, is that it does not include contract workers. And I think you have a question later about contract workers. But so that is still something that President Ryan is quite aware has to be addressed as well.
We can actually go to that question now. So has there been a rise in contract workers, and what do you think this does for the university and the campaign?
I think that over time there has been an increase in the use of contract laborers. Right now one of the biggest companies to whom work is outsourced is Aramark. But one thing that I discovered, and this is actually in the context of the hunger strike, I was one of the people who was speaking to the administration. We thought we were negotiating. They thought they were just telling us to go away, as it turned out. But we were really asking about how many contract workers there were, what they are paid, whether or not the university would be willing to make a living wage a criterion for signing on with a particular company. And they really said they didn't know, and that maybe they should, if only because some people felt that they could maybe save money by contracting out more work. So there's been this idea that somehow it's not our business, they pay what they pay, and somehow that we can't stipulate that they pay a living wage, when in fact the city, when they became in 2000 a living wage city, again partly very much as a response to the campaign at UVA, their policy affects contract workers also, and they do make it a criterion of contracting with the city that these companies pay a living wage. So there were some there were some legal questions raised about it, but clearly it's a sort of gray area, and the city decided to go ahead, and that has not been challenged. So I think it's pretty clear that they could do that. There are models for doing that. And if they don't, if anything, because they could pay as little as the federal minimum wage, which is $7.25. I think Aramark now pays 10 something. That was less than the university was paying. In terms of benefits or job security, all kinds of things. We really don't know, but it's clear that those workers are more precarious than people directly employed by UVA. So unless there's a living wage policy that includes contract workers, you could have on paper UVA employees doing very well, and then you could have most of the work being done by contract workers. And in fact, there would be an incentive to do that because they generally pay less. There would be an economic incentive, not an ethical incentive. So that's really unfinished business. It's absolutely crucial that contract workers be included in any policy.
Okay. And we talk a lot about the protests of 2006 in our research and our project, and so we wanted to hear what your experience was of that event and how that changed things for the campaign, or brought them in a different direction than
Right,
before?
right. It was actually, it was a time, the union lasted between 2002 and 2008. And it was a time when I was really working as a kind of faculty support person for the staff union. And interestingly, although there was a staff union, it was a time when, actually I thought the students were very brave, and it, was, did result in this pay bump. So it was very successful in that sense. But I actually regretted that it was a time when staff and students could have worked more closely together, because there really were staff representatives at that point, and people who kind of stuck their necks out as advocates for working conditions. And they obviously supported the sit-in, but they weren't directly involved in any way. And so neither was I. So I can't really speak to it from an insider's point of view. I was very supportive of it, obviously. But one thing that was interesting to me is, as you know, people were arrested, including a faculty member, Wendy Marshall. So that actually was instructive in terms of the 2012 hunger strike, because what students realized is that because one way that sit-ins are successful is that they get media coverage, and in fact, if students are arrested, that actually only contributes to it being, visible event. So the lesson of the university is, if there's a sit-in, shut it down right away. Don't let that go on, because then the bad publicity goes on. The students who organized the hunger strike realized that that's not breaking any rules. There is some rule about students not endangering themselves, but they were very canny, and they had a doctor overseeing them, and they were drinking juice. And so, they obviously, no one wanted students actually to be harmed. But it was really quite a brilliant strategy, and it's obviously a strategy that goes back to the suffrage campaigns and campaigns for Irish independence, where people use hunger strikes as a form of protest. And but I thought, in terms of over against the sit-in, students went for 12 days, and then they did reach bodily limits, but they were able to get a lot of national attention. It was really moving how they, like the sit-in students, really did put their bodies on the line, and in that sense, it again just it had a similar effect in terms of ending up increasing wages.
Do you think that a minimum wage of $15 an hour is adequate? And what would you choose an ideal minimum wage, along with the $16.34 with the campaign?
Yeah, I think said
yeah.
all there is to say. No, I don't. 15 is
right.
Great. It's much better than I think the wage before that was 12 something. So that's huge, and it's a figure that has been used nationally. But Charlottesville is one of the more expensive places to live, and as we know, there's also a kind of crisis in terms of affordable housing, and plus, the cost of living goes up. So, I think that 1684 figure is a more current figure, and even that, I think, will be obsolete soon. So, I know that one thing that was said before President Ryan raised wages is that one of the members of the Board of Visitors said, oh, well, when you include benefits, it actually is up to 16 something. But that's never how living wage is calculated. There are so many things that cannot, benefits are great, and workers get good benefits, but that doesn't pay the rent. That doesn't pay your car insurance. That doesn't put food on the table. So that was a really kind of fallacious kind of argument.
We would love to see some of the images or
so I think that one thing that is really important is just kudos to President Ryan for making that move, but I really do see that as the culmination. That was not just his waving his magic wand. That was the result of again, this very arduous sort of kind of waves of attention to this issue and activism on the part of, again, students, staff, and faculty. So part of this show and tell is just showing that like a lot of people have been at this for a really long time. And again, I can't stress enough that, although during these 20 years, I've been one of the people who's been pretty consistently active, I am so not alone. At any moment, I couldn't have done anything by myself. So it was really important that there was, even though it was a small group, a group of people who got it started, and then really just generations of students who've kept it going, and generations of staff too, for that matter. So this was where we started. This was the teach-in with the labor movement. And we had everyone from Julian Bond to this woman, Barbara Prayar, was chair of a housekeepers association at UNC. So, and then it was a year later, it was on tax day, April 15th of 1998, that we launched the campaign. So that's Joy Johnson, who was a local activist. That's Julian Bond. So, and then we just, we did all kinds of rallies, countless rallies. We were, on the downtown mall. We tabled at the county fair. Say we had these buttons. We had petitions. We reached out to local churches, coordinated with Virginia Organizing. So one thing that happened is that a woman who worked for, not for UVA, but for one of the food service companies, got sent home because she was wearing an $8 button. And so then we had to shift into, again, so this has all been part of it, is raising awareness about what workers' rights are and the fact that you have the right to organize and to speak out and to wear a button and not suffer retaliation. So, we said, it's your right to take this flyer. And then there was another moment, actually, when some hospital workers were fired unfairly, and we went to bat for them, and most of them ended up getting reinstated, and the rest got some compensation. So again, sort of educating people that, if there is some kind of, unjust labor practice, you can speak out, you can get justice, you don't have to just cower. But really the climate, generally speaking overall, has been really anti-labor and one of intimidation. And I mentioned before that even today, staff are really loath to speak out. But speaking of unions, so again, you can't have collective bargaining, but there are unions, and one is the, I guess it's the American Federation of State, County, and Municipal Employees. They were based over in the Valley, and those guys were involved in a lot of our protests.
Oh, wow.
So, and then when we did form a staff union, it was affiliated with Communication Workers of America. So then in 2000, that's when the city of Charlottesville declared that they were living wage. Am I holding these up? Okay.
Yes, perfect.
That they declared themselves a living wage employer. And then, it was that same spring that we had a victory rally, because that's when wages bumped up really almost $2 to up over up over $8 an hour. So, UVA is, it's a public university, so they're public employees. But again, sort of suggesting how much this was a space where people in town and businesses in town were sort of part of the campaign, is there was a kind of sister campaign focused on local hotels, specifically the Marriott, who are also not paying their workers a living wage. And so this is some news coverage of that. But there were a lot of people from the university campaign who were also involved in that campaign. Then this is, I mentioned already, the Hospital 9 who were fired. And that actually got national coverage in the New York Times, that was one of the women who was fired. So then, from really feeling that sort of impolite to speak about wages, and that workers would be fired if they complained about wages, by 2001, it really was a thing. And again, nationally, there were more university movements, there were more city movements. So this is Seville really covering at quite great length the campaign. There's a picture here of one of the more famous student protesters. Let's see. Whoops, I'm not finding the particular guy that I want to find. Nicholas Graber Grace. Here he is.
Oh, great.
So he was an undergraduate. He was arrested a number of times for doing things like chaining himself to the elevator in the Omni Hotel, because that was another hotel that wasn't paying a living wage. And what's great is that he has a much younger sister. She's like 12 years younger. 12 years later, she shows up, and right away, as a first year, she just continues to carry on. That was just particularly nice, since we've got like a whole dynasty of the same family, and their parents were activists too. One of the times that Nicholas was arrested, his mom was there cheering him on. But that's another point that I would make, is in terms of successes, that a number of, especially the undergraduates who were involved in the campaign, it was a kind of apprenticeship for them, and they have gone on to be professional organizers. A student who graduated, it's probably about 5 or 6 years ago now, maybe a little bit longer, Greg Kazar, he became an activist. He's from Texas. He went back to Austin and continued to be an activist there, and is now on the Austin City Council. And so that's really important, that it really, for a lot of undergraduates, it really was sort of the beginning of their being involved in this kind of justice work. So I guess those are the highlights of the.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Do you have any final concluding thoughts?
I think I've sort of hit the high points. The importance of coalition, and both the sort of the gratitude to President Ryan, but also the sense that unless there's a policy indexing wages to cost of living, and unless there's the inclusion of contract workers, that this wonderful gain is temporary and partial.
Right. Okay. Well, thank you so much.
Yeah.